The inauguration of a president is always a moment of symbolic weight, a time when the nation reflects on its past and looks towards its future. Donald Trump's second inauguration, however, carries a particular significance, coinciding as it does with Martin Luther King Jr. Day. This convergence prompts a question: to what extent does the Trump presidency and the societal shifts it represents align with King's dream of a less racially polarized America? At first glance, the suggestion might seem paradoxical. Trump's rhetoric, particularly during his first campaign, was often seen as divisive, and his presidency was marked by heightened tensions around issues of race and identity. Yet, a closer examination of voting patterns and demographic trends reveals a more nuanced picture. Far from exacerbating racial polarization, the Trump era has coincided with a discernible decline in its salience, particularly among younger voters. This is not to say that America has achieved a post-racial utopia. Systemic inequalities persist, and the legacy of discrimination continues to cast a long shadow. However, the evidence suggests that the intense focus on race and identity that has characterized recent decades may be waning, creating space for a broader conversation about the challenges facing the nation. Whether this trend continues and what it means for the realization of King's dream remains to be seen. One of the most striking features of recent elections has been the realignment of traditional voting blocs. The Democratic Party, once the party of the working class, now finds its base among predominantly white, college-educated professionals, while the Republican Party, once associated with big business, has made significant inroads among working-class voters of all races. This shift is reflected in the voting patterns of specific demographic groups. For instance, Trump garnered significant support from non-college educated Black and Hispanic voters, exceeding the levels of support he received from their college-educated counterparts. Similarly, white working-class voters, particularly women, swung heavily towards Trump, even as college-educated white women largely favored his opponents. These trends challenge the simplistic narrative of a racially polarized electorate, revealing a more complex picture in which class, education, and cultural values play significant roles. The decline of traditional industries, the rise of globalization, and the increasing importance of a college degree have all contributed to a sense of economic anxiety and cultural displacement among many working-class voters. These voters, regardless of race, have found themselves increasingly alienated from a Democratic Party seen as out of touch with their concerns and more responsive to the demands of a culturally liberal elite. This alienation has created an opening for a Republican Party that, under Trump, has adopted a more populist message, appealing directly to the economic anxieties and cultural grievances of this demographic. The realignment of American politics is not simply a product of economic forces. It also reflects a deeper cultural shift, particularly among younger generations. The so-called culture wars that have raged for decades, centered around issues such as abortion, gay rights, and affirmative action, seem to be losing their potency. Younger voters, less tethered to the ideological battles of the past, are more likely to hold liberal views on social issues, even as they express skepticism towards the Democratic Party's embrace of identity politics. This skepticism stems, in part, from a sense that the relentless focus on race and gender has come at the expense of addressing other pressing issues, such as economic inequality, climate change, and the rising cost of living. The Democratic Party's emphasis on identity has, paradoxically, alienated some voters of color, who feel that their concerns about jobs, education, and healthcare are being ignored. The declining salience of identity politics can also be attributed to the changing demographics of the United States. As the nation becomes increasingly diverse, the traditional categories of race and ethnicity become more fluid and less meaningful. Younger Americans growing up in a more multicultural society are more likely to see themselves as individuals with complex identities, rather than simply as members of a particular racial or ethnic group. The waning of racial polarization, while far from complete, creates an opportunity for a more constructive and less divisive political discourse. It allows for a renewed focus on shared challenges and common goals, rather than on the grievances of particular identity groups. This shift, if sustained, could pave the way for a more unified and just society, one that more closely aligns with the vision articulated by Martin Luther King Jr. King's dream was not simply about ending segregation or achieving legal equality, it was about creating a society in which people are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It was about building a nation where all citizens, regardless of their background, have the opportunity to thrive and reach their full potential. The decline of racial polarization does not mean that the struggle for racial justice is over. Systemic inequalities persist, and the legacy of discrimination continues to cast a long shadow. However, it does suggest that the terms of the debate are shifting, and that there is a growing appetite for a more nuanced and less divisive conversation about race in America. This shift creates an opening for a new generation of leaders to emerge, leaders who can articulate a vision of a just and equitable society that transcends the limitations of identity politics and speaks to the aspirations of all Americans.